Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Centurus webinar on Cognos performance tuning tips and tricks. Thank you for joining us today. Happy to have everyone here. In terms of today's agenda, some quick things. We'll do some quick introductions, go through some details of hardware and server specifics, architectural considerations, and then dig down a little more fine-grained to tuning of dispatchers and tuning on reports, and a handful of other useful tips are related to Cognos performance. Then we'll wrap up with a quick overview of Centurus and where you can get additional resources on our website. And again, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Our presenter today is Todd Schumann. He's our practice lead for installations, upgrades, and optimization here at Centurus. Todd lives in Northern Virginia with his family, and he's our Northern Virginia wine expert. Todd has been involved in business analytics for over 20 years. He's been involved with Cognos pretty much from the beginning, so he really knows his way around with installations, upgrades, and performance. So Todd is our resident expert, and he'll be delivering the meat of today's webinar. I'm Steve Reed-Pittman. I'm Director of Enterprise Architecture and Engineering here at Centurus, but I'll mostly just be doing housekeeping here in the background today, and Todd will be the star of our show. Before I turn it over to Todd, we just want to do a couple of quick polls. So first one is just want to get a sense of what version of Cognos everybody out there is using today. So let me kick this off. I'm seeing a lot of Cognos 11.1x coming in, which is pretty common. I'm not seeing any Cognos 10 yet, which is interesting. We periodically find a few customers who are still running Cognos 10, and even recently had an inquiry from an organization that's still on a version of Cognos 8, which was pretty amazing to hear because it's been a long time since the Cognos 8 days. Just share the results here real quickly. So again, nobody on Cognos 10, and actually very few of you are on the early versions of Cognos 11. So the bulk of you are onto 11.1 or greater, and almost 20% of you are already moved on to Cognos 11.2. So that's great to hear. I know a lot of folks have been really, really happy with the new interface in 11.2. So let's go on to the next poll before I hand it over to Todd. And our next poll is about the performance pain points you're experiencing today in your Cognos environment. And this is a multiple choice poll. So you can choose as many of these as are applicable to your environment. So I've got quite a few responses coming in already. I see a lot of slow running reports and quite a bit of system instability coming in. So that's pretty common, and Todd is going to talk in some detail about some of the things you can do in terms of stability, particularly around memory and Cognos admin sort of tuning settings that can help with some of that. Share those results. So again, a lot of slow running reports, some report failures, quite a bit of system instability, and administration is confusing, which has been true from day one, and I predict it will be true for as long as Cognos exists. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hide those results, and I'm going to turn it over to Todd for our detailed presentation.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Got a lot to cover today, so I'm going to kind of get going through some of the material here. Just to kind of level set, with Cognos, I saw there seems to be a lot of different issues people are having with Cognos. Unfortunately, there's not necessarily a silver bullet that's going to fix everything. There's lots of different pieces to Cognos, and a single, bottleneck anywhere in that can cause, major effects. So some of the most common software and hardware bottlenecks include, process threading. So you've got, the ability to run more reports, but you don't have your dispatchers tuned to allow them to process it. So you'll get, maybe I think the default setting will let about 8 reports or so run. But if you're able to handle that and you've got, just idle CPU and RAM available, people are stuck in a waiting queue while those other reports run. So how can you, up your your number of threads you have so that you can have more people running reports and less waiting. The other side of the coin is, you have too much going on. You're running out of memory. If you're using dynamic query mode in JVM, you've got garbage collection that's constantly being run and just chewing up a lot of resources on your machine. So there's lots of different things that can cause it. Outside of that, you've got a poorly performing database, badly designed models, the report is poorly designed. There's just so many different areas that can be causing the issue in Cognos. So the best way to kind of troubleshoot that is just to kind of look through each point of failure and see is this the issue. If I run the SQL directly against the database, is it slow? Is Cognos running all reports slow or just certain reports? So a lot of information. I'm going to try to get through as many of these scenarios and touch on these as possible. But as Steve mentioned, we will have a Q&A session. So if I don't get to your question, feel free to put a note in the Q&A panel, and we'll try to get to it either live on the session or we'll post the answers to the Q&A within a couple of days typically. Starting off with just hardware and server specifics, I usually like to post these at least every major build. So 11.1 had more prerequisites as far as how much CPU and RAM you need to run it than 11.0 did, and 11.2 has even more than 11.1. So it's pretty easy to find this stuff on the web. Just search for supported software environments, Cognos, and they've got all the different versions, the major and minor builds by different platforms. So you've got Linux and Windows, different operating systems. It shows you all the different databases and drivers and all that good stuff. So put a link on here just in case you want to use this, but you can just search for this as well. As far as operating systems, okay, this is 11.2.2, sort of, three main different OSs. There's different flavors of Linux that you can run, but essentially, these are the four that are typically used. Red Hat, Ubuntu, and then Windows typically are the ones that we primarily deal with. Windows Server is 2019, which is sort of the latest version of that. So again, depending on what version you're on, if you're on 2012, it might be a good time to move to 2019. At some point, maybe in 11.3, they're going to, no longer support Windows Server 2012. So if you're going to do upgrade, try to get on the latest version as possible, just so you don't get stuck with a supported version of Cognos but unsupported OS. Databases. So again, just quick clarification. There's two different databases in Cognos's world. There's its own content store database that is information about the reports, your users, the folders, the models, the security, all that stuff. It's basically a database just about Cognos information, which is different than the databases that you want to report off of. So the databases you're reporting off of that you want to see in your reports, there's well over 100 different databases and versions that it supports. The databases that can contain the Cognos information is limited to just these, 4 or 5. So we've got DB2, Informix, SQL Server, Oracle, and Azure SQL databases, which are more or less just cloud-based, SQL Server instances running in the Azure portal. But those are sort of the ones that you're limited to when setting up a content store database. So again, not too much is changing here. They do occasionally, remove some of the numbers or the versions on the left side of this. So if you're on, SQL 2012, again, Oracle 11G, those things have been around for a long time now, 10 plus years. It's time to start making plans to get off those older databases. And then browsers, this is sort of the biggest news with 11.2. If you've attended any of our other What's New webinars or any of my webinars about upgrading, the big news is that Internet Explorer is no longer supported at all. You will need to now, switch to Edge or Chromium or Firefox or even Safari. Those versions are really the only versions of the browsers that you can use. You actually will get a message pop up if you try to log in with IE that says this browser is not supported and you're kind of stuck. For those of you who are still using some of the old legacy studios like Analysis Studio, Query Studio, pretty much the only real way to do it is to use Firefox now. There may be some kind of, extension plugins for Chrome and Edge that you can get, but again, nothing fully supported. If you're not going to get any help from IBM on those tools. So if you haven't moved to 11.2 yet, just make sure you're prepared to lose IE support. And if you have legacy studios turned on, make sure you have a plan in place for that. And then finally, hardware. Again, this is generic IBM sizing from that document I listed the link to. They recommend for a single environment, doesn't matter how many users, they're saying 4 cores, 32 gigs of RAM, and about 15 plus gigs of RAM or disk space to install and have some temp space. Again, you may be able to get by with less than this, and you're definitely going to want to have probably more than this if you're running, a production environment with, a lot of usage, lots of users. It's not necessarily one size fits all. I also like to put on here, there's obviously with virtual machines, some of this stuff gets hidden nowadays because you kind of just have, what the VM says you have, but underneath those VMs, and I'll talk about VMs a little later, you've got a motherboard inside the host machine, the physical machine that's hosting that virtual machine. And that's got sockets. You can have, multiple sockets on there. Each socket can have a CPU, and each CPU can have multiple cores, and each core can have threading. So it's just layers upon layers of complexity. So when I talk about cores, we're talking about, how many cores on a CPU. There's that term CPU versus core gets kind of thrown around loosely. So I just put a couple slides just to kind of clarify about that. So we want to have 4 CPUs, 32 gigs of RAM. The memory requirements have gone up significantly since 11.0. And then disk space, if you're using any type of file uploads, you want to kind of allocate about 500 megs or so per user. And you can adjust those and cap it at, this is how much each user can have, or just disable file uploads altogether. But if you do allow that, you want to make sure you have plenty of disk space. Going to jump into some architecture setups. So with Cognos, there are infinite number of ways you can configure your environment. There's obviously just standard, let's put everything on a single box, and that works fine. You can, essentially the main components we've got are, a gateway, a dispatcher or an application tier, and then a content manager / content tier component, those 3 kind of main components. And like I said, you could put them all in a single box. That works fine for a lot of people. Very simple to set up and run Cognos that way. As you continue to grow, you may want to introduce some load balancing, some failover. This slide here is sort of a generic slide that's been around for, I think, as long as I've been kind of working with Cognos. We've got, different tiers. We've got a presentation web tier with the gateway. Our application tier, we've got some dispatchers with content managers. And we've got connections to our security namespace, our Active Directories, LDAPs, Conjur databases, our reporting databases. I've got some OLAP cubes here. So kind of a very generic, basic distributed environment here where we kind of put individual components of each Cognos installation on different servers, and they can kind of help each other out, balance the load, move things to different servers if things are busy. So this is going to be sort of a next level, second stage of your sort of Cognos environment. If you're on a single server today, it's getting kind of busy, you've added more resources, it's still not keeping up. The next step would be to kind of go what's called a distributed environment. And there's obviously different ways to do that. So we can introduce something called failover. The content manager is, again, like sort of the brains of Cognos. It works with that content store database. It's going to have one active content manager in any type of environment. So when that is active, we can add additional content managers to our environment, and they are going to notice that there's already one active and just sit in a standby mode. And they're going to be constantly just sending small packets of information back and forth, just making sure that content manager is still active and responsive. If you were to have, some kind of server crash, or this machine here, was to go down, this is going to instantly become aware and then become the active content manager, and that's called failover. So if you've got a Cognos environment that has mission critical information, or you just want to have, better stability, this is one option to kind of have a secondary content manager. In that case, this can fail and you can still be, up and running with users getting access to the reports if they need to. That isn't the same thing as high availability. This is where we have, no single point of failure. We need to have at least 2 of each Cognos component, and we also need to have a load balancer outside of our gateway. So in this environment here, I do have failover, here and here. But if this web server was to go down, I don't have a way for users to log in directly right now. There's no URL for them. Same thing, with a dispatcher here. If I only had one dispatcher and it went down, just because I have 2 content managers, I'm still not going to be able to run reports. So we've got several points of failure in this failover environment, Whereas here with high availability, I've got 2 gateways, I've got multiple dispatchers, and on these dispatchers, I've also got content managers or CM servers, one running as active, one running as standby. So any one of these servers can go down and I'm still up and running. Users aren't aware that anything has even happened. So if you do need high availability, you're going to want to have, at least something like this. You can get away with a minimum of 3 servers, kind of putting all of them on different pieces. If you're interested in kind of keeping the server cost down, you can do it in about 3. But this is sort of an ideal architecture for, that high availability configuration here. Okay, getting into the dispatcher tuning. This is, again, a ton of information here. I think there was a lot of people who on the poll were saying, the administration is confusing, and I definitely agree. The first time you go into these dispatcher tuning screens, there are about 87 line items here. That is just completely overwhelming. I don't know why they decided to make this huge long list. I think it would make more sense to kind of group them into services or just in a better way to kind of make it more usable. But I'll go through it, and I think explaining a little bit helps, at least in my opinion. Even though there's 87 different settings, the majority of these are repetitive. So you'll notice terms like high affinity, low affinity, number of processes, peak, non-peak, and then the name of the service. So it might be kind of small font here, but you see the word batch is in here. I've got metadata services, batch services. Down below, I've got reporting services. So all the main services have a high affinity setting, a low affinity setting. They have a number of processes settings. They have what's called peak and non-peak settings. So you have about 8 or 10, maybe even 12 different variations of the exact same groupings of these, just for different services and different variations of these 4. Obviously, there's some that don't fall into this bucket, but if you kind of look at all the different services and the different options around them, they kind of repeat themselves. So once you kind of understand what these all are, it makes a lot more sense, and I'll kind of break those down now. So high affinity essentially means things that you want a sub-second response time on. Common examples of these are if you run a report in HTML and you have 20 rows on the first page and you click page down, you want that page down to happen very quickly and move to the next row. You don't want to have to hit page down and just watch it spin for another 5-10 minutes, especially if you've got 20 plus pages you need to scroll through. If you do see that you're spinning a lot on page down, it probably means you don't have enough high affinity available for the reporting service. Other topics like page up, page down, top, bottom, run the report again, returning back to the main portal, and then even sending things out like if you want to save a report or email it or view a saved output. Those are all things that should be relatively quick for users, and those need to have a high affinity connection available in order to do that. The low affinity ones are the ones that you would expect to take longer. These are, I click a report, it's running, you're watching that wheel spin, it's going and getting the data and basically building a report. So reporting, report processing, even in the report authoring tool, when you first open up a package, it has to kind of go and scan that package and say, okay, I see you've got 10 different namespaces, and inside that you've got folders and query subjects and filters. All that stuff, takes a low affinity request. Query validation, if you test your queries or your calculations, it kind of has to go and look and see what you're doing and see what the data types are. Those are going to be things that are low affinity. And even in the administration tasks, testing your data source connections, making sure the connection strings are correct, setting up folders, jobs, schedules, that involves writing back to the content store database and adding new content in there. So these are all things that are low affinity. So if you kind of think about what are things that I would want my users to have, very quick responses on, and what are things that I think users expect and I would expect to take longer, those are the low affinities. Outside of that, we've got services. So the dispatcher is going to start all of these by default. You can turn on and off some of these in the Cognos configuration, but you can see here there's a long list of all these different services. I don't know how many there are here, but 20 to 30 or so, and they occasionally add new ones to this list. But the only ones you really need to concern yourself with are, for tuning, I would say, are 3, sort of the batch, the reporting, and the query services. And just to kind of explain on those, batch services is essentially things that you run in the background. So when you have jobs, schedules, if you go into a report and say deliver their output of this report in a PDF and then just send it to me when you're done, then you click OK, you're no longer actively or interactively watching the results of that report come back. It's now running in the background. As soon as it's available, it will send it to you. That's going to take up a batch service connection. Other things like saved outputs, generating saved outputs, or running triggers, all these things kind of happen in the background and use the batch service connections. The reporting service is the ones that I go into report, I click the report, it asks me to pick, fiscal year and the product line I want to see, and I click OK, and I watch that wheel spin, and then the results come back, and I'm paging up, paging down, possibly interacting with additional filters, and if you have interactive browser turned on, interacting with the report. Those are report services. And then query service is using the dynamic query mode. It's similar to the report service, but now we're talking about the DQM engine, which is also going to get into your Java heaps and your JVM, which we'll also touch on in a little bit. So these are sort of the three that I target typically with dispatcher tuning. I want to look at the report services, the high and low affinities, batch and query service. The other one that kind of gives you a different variation of all the different tuning settings is peak versus non-peak. Out of the box, these are the starting and ending hours of your peak. So it uses a 24-hour military time clock. So 7 a.m. is your start date, 1800 hours, 6 p.m. is your end date. You can tweak this to whatever you want. So if your day ends a little earlier or starts later, feel free to change these numbers. And then that way, anytime you see how many connections or high affinity connections do I want to have during peak for my report service? How many do I want to have for my batch reporting and off peak? You can kind of have those hours align with when your users are in the office, when people are actually logging in and running reports. And general recommended way to kind of set this up is during peak hours, you want to have people who are actually running reports interactively with the reporting service. Give them the priority. Don't make them wait. They're staring at the screen. They're waiting impatiently. If you're giving all the priority to people running schedules in the background, they're going to get frustrated. Typically, if you're not waiting for something, you're sending emails or doing other work, and then an email comes through your email from Cognos. It took an extra 5 minutes than expected. Then they're going to be fine because they probably weren't staring there waiting for it, ripping their hair out. So you want to kind of again give the report service the priority during the peak hours, and then once those peak hours are done, people are leaving the day, they're at home, then give all the processing power, the majority of the processing power to the batch service. Let those things run overnight, get them out quickly. Those early morning reports that people want to see when they first get to work, make sure they have enough connections and it's tuned properly to allow that to happen, so that things aren't just all loaded up when people get into work and you kind of got no slots available to get anything done. Another thing we can do is called routing rules. This is kind of a very underutilized Cognos feature that I like to always introduce. You can set this up, again, in multiple different ways. Essentially, you can have multiple, if you have a distributed environment, you can have dedicated servers for specific things. So one of the initial ways that I've seen it used is people who want to convert to DQM and turn on 64-bit report execution mode. That means you have to have everything running in and converted to DQM. So if you've got any kind of transformer power cubes, or you've just got some reports or packages that haven't been converted, you're not going to be able to convert it to 64-bit execution mode unless you've got everything running on there. So if you don't, you can spin up another dispatcher, have that run in 32-bit mode, and have all packages that are not CQM or not DQM get routed to that second server. So it's one way to kind of have traffic going to the servers that can handle that specific type of reporting engine, whether it's DQM or CQM. Another commonly used way to set this up is if you've got sort of a mixed licensing agreement, which I've seen from time to time. Example of a company that's got 10 executives who really want a fast, high-powered Cognos environment. They've got 8 cores, they've got 128 gigs of RAM, and they paid for 10 named user licenses, and they want to run it on that fast server. They also have thousands of store owners across the country that that they don't want to pay individual licenses for, so they're going to use a PVU unlimited based licensing type of setup where you're kind of paying for the hardware, not the users, and they're going to kind of scale that down. It's going to be 4 cores, and that can be routed based on AD groups, so that the executives are going to get that blazing fast speed. The people who are run the daily sales report at a Cognos at the different shops across the country, they'll be routed to a slower server, and they can run it in the background. They don't care as much as not doing all the analytics and slicing and dicing the data. So another good way to do it. And then even just breaking up report and batch services. If you're sending out schedules all day long and you just have schedules running forever, and you can't really break up batch and report service on the same server, then go ahead and have a dedicated reporting server and a dedicated batch server. Free up all that space that's on the reporting server, so that people who are actually interactively running reports aren't being bogged down or losing resources, and then have a dedicated server outside of that that's just strictly running schedules all day long. So again, just a couple examples of routing rules, but they're really powerful, very easy to set up, and very easy to configure, and there's just lots of ways to kind of benefit from those. Another topic that, again, is useful for sizing is the concurrent user. This is sort of, again, a very generic rule. This may or may not be exactly right, but this is what IBM is going to give you, and a lot of companies are going to give you when they ask you, how many concurrent users do you have? And essentially, it's take 100. If you have 100 named users, consider 10 of them active at one time, and out of those 10 active users, one of them is actively concurrently using the environment right now, clicking on that report and running it. So for example, if you had 4,000 named users, you'd expect to have about 40 concurrent users. And again, it can be up and down depending on the time of day and how active your users are, and it's sort of a very generic, not perfect rule, but it's helpful for sizing. So figuring out your concurrent user number is going to be something that you're going to want to have for sizing for sure. And then finally, you kind of take all those different concepts, the high and low affinities, what service are we tuning, when's peak and when's non-peak, report versus batch, and you've got these different groupings. Here's one for peak report servicing. So you've got high affinity connections, low affinity connections, and the number of processes for that during that period. So these are just going to repeat for all the different services, the non-peak, the peak and non-peak hours. So you kind of find all these in those 87 or whatever it was, dispatcher settings, and go in and change these to what you need. So in the example above, I've got 2 high affinities, I've got 8 low affinities, and I've got 2 processes for that service. So again, I don't know why they do it this way. It's confusing to me, but essentially you're going to take the number of connections, the number of processes, and you're going to multiply it by each of these, and that's sort of how many threads you're going to be running at one time. So if you were to kind of be fully burdened and allow this to happen with no batch, you're using about 20 total threads or connections to support this grouping right here. So I have in lots of tuning exercises I've been involved in, people will go and kind of jack up these numbers really high and not really know what's going on. And you'll see typically what happens is unless you've got a really beefy machine, it's going to get very unstable. The CPU is going to be hitting 100%. You're going to be chewing up all your memory, and basically no one's going to be getting what they want. And that's because people see, hey, how come everyone's waiting for a report? I don't want to make anybody wait. Let's give them more connections and more slots, open them up and let them run. And Cognos just can't keep up. So it's much better to have people wait a couple minutes or a couple seconds, hopefully, and have things at least getting moved through the queue and processed, and then move on to the next, the next person in line, versus just saying, hey, have at it. Everyone run reports whenever they want, and let's have Cognos just figure it out. It's not going to handle that very well. So you're going to want to make sure that you kind of slowly bump up these numbers if you're moving away from the sort of default numbers that come with Cognos. But again, don't really make significant changes until you've had time to test these. Let me just jump to a slide here. So again, this is underutilized versus overutilized. So again, if you're seeing this type of CPU, this 2% or very low CPU utilization, and you've got reports that are in a waiting status, then you're a good candidate to want to kind of bump up those numbers. Let's increase the number of connections, possibly increase the number of high and low affinities, and see how that responds. Versus here, this is too much is happening. The server isn't able to get anything done. It's most likely going to come crashing down pretty soon. So you want to kind of, get somewhere in the middle. You don't want to be at 100%, but upper 80s, is fine as long as you're not, flatlining at 100% CPU utilization. That means you're taking full advantage of the server. So somewhere in between, and just kind of monitor these. There's tools outside of, just watching it live, perfmon, things like that. Kind of monitor your settings over time and see what the sweet spot is. Getting into the DQM and the Java heap, this could be a whole separate webinar on its own. There's a lot here. Essentially, there's settings at the very bottom of the dispatcher for tuning the Java heap. There are default settings, and then I usually recommend bumping these up. So the current default setting I think is 1024 megabytes. I always bump that up to about 4 gig. Gives you a much bigger window to start with. It's going to be quicker. It doesn't have to kind of ramp up on the fly. So as soon as Cognos is starting up, it's going to kind of allocate about 4 gigs for the JVM that runs the DQM service. And then there's going to be a limit that you can set. And again, that default is about 8 gig. I usually like to double that as well, unless you've got major limitations on how much RAM you have. So again, those 32 gigs of RAM as sort of a starting point from Cognos. If you're using dynamic query mode, you're going to want to bump up the RAM and bump up the sort of the Java heap limit to at least this. There's a whole other topic I can get into. I'll probably either do like a blog post or a separate webinar at some point on just the JVM tuning and garbage collection. Essentially, you can tune that as well. There's ways to kind of monitor your Java dump files and on a lot of the Java activity and kind of figure out, what your garbage collection looks like. And essentially, you want to have it, when the garbage collection occurs, you want it to be very quick, and you want it to not be doing the garbage collection frequently. So hopefully it happens, every couple hours, and it happens for like 10, 15 seconds. If it's happening every couple minutes and it's taking a couple minutes at a time, that's going to cause significant issues in your environment. So again, I will probably do something a little bit more on that just due to time constraints. I'm not going to have ability to go into that in deep depth today. I did put a couple links out here if you're interested in learning more. So here's the DQM tuning guide. It's about 100 pages of very light reading, but it's got a lot of good information in there as well. And if anyone on the call today or the webinar today is using dynamic cubes, these are going to be a bit different sizing activity for that. There's a IBM Redbook link here to that. Dynamic cubes are sort of a different animal. They are obviously memory intensive, so you'll be looking at sort of different sizing around those if you're using those. Another good way to kind of monitor a lot of these Java activities is at least in Windows with the Task Manager. And the standard Task Manager doesn't give you much information. If you kind of look at it and try to figure out what's going on, you'll be like, I see there's some Java stuff running here, but I don't know what the heck it's doing. It's difficult to kind of figure that out. So if you kind of go into your details panel or tab of the Task Manager and right-click on the heading up here, you can say select or hide columns, and you go ahead and add the image path name and the command line. That'll give you a lot more information so you can actually see what it's actually doing, and you can figure out, okay, this is the application that's running Cognos, this is the JVM query engine, this is an actual report that's running. You get a lot more information as to what's running, how much RAM is it using, what's the CPU utilization. It just makes it much easier to kind of to look at a live, active Cognos environment and figure out what's going on. And in case you're having some stability issues, it's helpful to kind of see what's happening. So this is a very easy way to kind of filter out the junk of things outside of Cognos and also focus on what are these actually using as far as the Java inside of Cognos. For the specific tuning, a different sort of area. So outside of dispatcher tuning, we've got your dispatcher could be totally fine and it's the report, and that's obviously a big issue. Lots of times, it's just a difficult report. Either it's a ton of data, is reporting off of an untuned database or possibly a transactional database. The model itself could be bad. Lots of different things can go wrong here. So report-specific tuning is going to be, a one-off type of exercise. Sort of a lesser-known feature that was introduced in 11.1, I believe. I forget exactly what version, but they introduced this Interactive Performance Analyzer, the IPA, and it's pretty helpful in my opinion, especially trying to troubleshoot slow running reports. To get to it, you just go to your run options at the very bottom. There's under run HTML, PDF, Excel. At the very bottom, there should be run options. It brings up this sort of window here, and there's a slider that I kind of called out here, include performance details. You just check that slider, hit OK, and run it. It does require it to be run in HTML, and it'll give you an output, and I'll show you the next slide what that looks like. And it'll kind of break down, if you've got a list and a crosstab and a visualization and a map or something all on the same page. It'll show you how long it took to render each one, how long it took to bring back the data for each one, and also an overall page statistic as to page took 375 milliseconds and this and that. So it can be helpful to kind of show you if there's a specific object on the page or a specific query that's causing an issue, where do you want to look? And they did recently introduce this for dashboards. However, they made it difficult to find for some reason. There's a sort of hidden serviceability pane in dashboards. If you press Control Plus in there, it kind of opens up this serviceability window here, which is helpful for kind of tuning and troubleshooting dashboards. And at the very bottom, there's a show duration for all of those visualizations, and it kind of gives you that same sort of little view as to what each piece or each widget or so took to render. So here's an example. This is one of the generic samples from Cognos. I took it, I ran the IPA on it, and it may be difficult to see, but there's sort of these execution times, how long this table here took, how long this packed bubble, this column chart, this line chart, what are we looking at as far as execution times? There's this little eye information icon that if you mouse over, it will actually show you. It says execution, it'll actually give you the breakout of, here's how long it took to retrieve the data, here's how long it took to render it, and you can kind of get that breakout as well. And then finally at the bottom, it shows you total execution time. So again, this is pretty quick report. I think 9 milliseconds it took to load. But if I wanted to kind of get nitpicky, I could start looking at some of the lesser performing ones like this bubble chart here. This took about almost 2 seconds. I would start looking at what can be done to speed this up. Is there anything in here that's causing it to be a little bit slower? I could probably ignore this one because they're less than a second each, so that's pretty quick. Again, if you've got slow performing reports, very easy to kind of use this tool to kind of at least figure out where on the report is an issue. If it's the whole report in general, or there's just things that you can't seem to really tune, data sets have sort of become the go-to get out of jail free card in my opinion. These really weren't where I wanted them to be until I think 11.17. But back in the old Cognos 8-10 days, there wasn't anything like this. You had to kind of either build a cube possibly, or a summary table in the database, materialized views, things like that. Now in Cognos, especially with 11.17, where they added this sort of report interface on top of data sets, you can now take your entire report query with joins and all kinds of complexity, drop it right into a data set and say, go ahead and just load this into memory, and then have your report driven off that instead of the actual packages using today, which is probably a live SQL connection or something like that. It's going to be loaded in memory. It's going to be extremely fast, and it's almost like cheating. So you can just literally copy paste it in there, load it into a data set. You can even schedule it with the Cognos scheduler to say, I need the data to be refreshed, every night or even throughout the day, and have that report pointing to that, and it's just going to be blazing fast. So, these data sets, if you haven't used them in the past, they were, helpful, but you were kind of limited to basically just kind of pulling in, a flat file and just loading it in there. And you kind of had to, merge them together with data modules if you wanted to have multiple data sets. Now you can have all kinds of complexity in there, which I think is great. So yeah, definitely check out data sets for slow reports. And then going into some other tips outside of Cognos, or at least out of Cognos Dispatcher and port tuning. I did see a question earlier in the Q&A panel about the content store database. So this is another area that gets really large over time, especially if you've been a long time Cognos user. This thing can get massive. Typically a content manager database is going to start off, 2 gigs or less. as you continue to use the tool and people build reports and run all kinds of stuff out there, it's going to grow. And I've seen these things get, massive, like hundreds of gigabytes. And there are good ways to clean these up. And a lot of them are really easy to use. They're right out of the admin tool. If you go to the configuration, content administration, if you've ever done deployments, you're kind of familiar with, at least where we're at. These sort of import exports here, but these sort of, I guess the fifth one from the left, it's got different sort of maintenance tasks in here. There's a consistency check, which is very helpful. This is something that you should probably schedule, weekly or monthly. What that does is it goes and checks and makes sure that people who have profiles and content in your Cognos environment are still with the company. So it kind of scans and says, okay, I see an active profile for John Doe. I look for his Active Directory account and it doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. That person is no longer here. I'm going to go and just clean up all the stuff that he may have created, and he may have, a bunch of, old PDFs, saved outputs that he saved over time that are just sitting there idle. That's taking up, 5 gig of space in the content store. Clean that up. Content removal is another one. You can go and say, I want to remove any content that was created, and you could set it, I think, days or months, and you could say, in the last 6 months, you can do the last 1 month, you can do the last 5 days, and have that run on a daily schedule, and it's kind of do like a running, cleanup trail. So everything, after a certain number of days, just gets removed out of there, because there's going to be a lot of old stuff that people may not even know is there. For example, I saw, one of the customers who had a large content store database. We looked at it and found that someone had been running about like a 400-page PDF every single day in their my folders. And had no idea that it was even running, and there was just hundreds of stacks of versions of this report that were just taking up tons of space. So we ran a content removal, and we saw the database instantly, lose over 100 gigabytes of space. So it's just a great thing to, figure out, what is a reasonable amount of time that someone can keep something, or a snapshot of something. If you need it longer than that, it should be probably, saved to the local file system or put somewhere else. It shouldn't live in the content store forever. So definitely check out the content removal. Very similar to that is the retention rule. So you can kind of say, you can only have X amount of versions. Anything beyond that, we want to clean up. So check out some of these scripts. Very, user-friendly, easy to run, and you can set them up and schedule them so that they continue to run into the future. Another nice, lesser-known way to tune your content store database is to separate if you're a heavy schedule, job, email blast type customer that's constantly running stuff, separate all that activity out of the content store database into its own notification database. So when you're in your Cognos configuration, if you've set up an audit database, it's very similar to that. You kind of, in the notifications mail area, you can just right click and add in another database for the notifications, and it will pull all that extra junk out of it and put it in its own database. So that way your content store database is going to be less bloated. There's a lot less for it to process. It's got its own dedicated notification database for all your schedules and jobs. So that can also save you a lot of time and also put less strain on your content store database if it's busy doing other things. And then finally, just a quick pitch here on the migration assistant. We do have a tool if you're having kind of trouble reviewing your entire environment and figuring out what's what. There's just hundreds of reports or thousands of reports, and you can't even keep track of what's what. We've got a tool called Migration Assistant. If you'd like to learn more about it, check our website and our knowledge base. We've had a couple of demos on that, but it can kind of give you a full inventory as well as audit usage, and then give you full lineage and all the information you could possibly want about, your inventory in Cognos. That can also help with migrations and things like that. Another area that you can use to kind of clean up your content store database is in the installation directory. Not a lot of people know about this, but there's a bunch of scripts that Cognos provides. They are in the directory I kind of listed here. You should start using the standard installation directory. It's the program files, IBM Cognos, Analytics, Configuration, Schemas, Content, and then in that folder you'll see there's like a folder called SQL Server. There'll be one for Oracle, DB2. They all kind of have their own specific folder. And you've got all these different scripts in there, and a lot of them I wouldn't mess with, but some that are very helpful, especially for size profiling, is this, the C size profiling MS SQL Server. Obviously, the name changes a bit for each database, but this will actually, you point it to your Cognos content store database, you run it, it's going to give you a really nice output that shows you counts by all the object types. So how many queries do your reports do? How many reports do? How many dashboards, packages, folders, users, all that information. And it's also going to give you a really nice output of those output, saved files I talked about. How many output files are saved in the content store database? And it actually will group them into different sizes. Like these are with, less than 500K. These are 1 to 10 meg, 10 to 20, and then, up to massive size, like over 100 gigs, and show you, how many of each type are in each bucket and what the total disk space is and all that stuff. So you can really figure out what a mess you have, and then take steps to kind of use those other scripts here to kind of clean that up and then review and see if it's, getting it cut down to where you want it to be. So definitely, between those and these built-in ones, you can really kind of help tune your database. There are other areas besides content as well. There's like, I think it's the notifications or something. There's an area specific to schedules and saved outputs as well that you can use to kind of clear out your schedule, like NC drop. If you ever had to clear out your schedules, do upgrades, there's like NC drop schedules. And then another one is not related to tuning, but that's just a helpful one that's in here that I always like to kind of point out is this add system admin member. If you've ever been locked out of Cognos, with a brand new Cognos environment, there's an everyone role that gets put into the system admin group. And when you set it up the first time, you add yourself or you add your AD group in there, and you remove the everyone group, so not everyone has access to the admin area. If for some reason, you removed it or you need to get into Cognos and you got locked out, this script here, you can just run it against the content store. It runs in 1 second. It adds that everyone role back into it, and then you can get back into the admin screens of Cognos and make those changes. So just a helpful script here as well that I have had to use from time to time if I ever got kind of locked out. Virtual machines. This is a slide I've had in my deck for a while, and there was a time when the traditional architecture was still pretty prevalent. I can't even remember the last time I've actually worked on a physical machine versus a VM or a cloud-based server, which is essentially also a VM. But the big issue here is that we've got smaller virtual machines, images running on a larger host machine. This sounds great, and it is great for the most part, but there are some things you need to consider, specifically dedicated and over allocating those virtual machines. So this happens all too frequently. I just picked some random numbers here, but assuming that this virtual machine, this host here, that's actually got the hardware that we want to provide to these smaller chunks. Let's say we've got a total of 20 cores on that and 96 gigs of RAM. People will go ahead and just chunk that up into a bunch of 8-core, 32 gigabyte RAM VMs, where it looks like we've got 32 cores now and 128 gigs of RAM, and they will share these resources, and some applications are fine with that. They don't need it all the time, and then they'll give it up and they'll pass it on. Cognos does not share well at all. It will not respond well in an environment like this. So you always want to make sure you have dedicated resources. Any type of resource pooling and sharing is disabled for a Cognos VM. It's going to latch on to that CPU and RAM and not let go. And if it does need more and it doesn't find it, it doesn't have it, it's going to be unstable and most likely cause some failures. On top of that, with the VM, you want to plan for about 5 to 10% overhead on top of what you're getting there. And also, it's only as good as the host it's on. I've done installations and some tuning on Cognos servers that say they've got 8 CPUs and tons of RAM, and it looks like we're on like the latest version of Windows, and it's just painfully slow. And after some complaining, they said, okay, we'll move you to the new host machine, and you wouldn't believe the speed difference between the same image getting moved to a new host. I mean, it was incredible. I think the Cognos loading screen was taking 30 seconds to even log someone in on the old one, and we moved it over and it was less than a second. So you can't really trust the specs that you see, through the OS on the VM. It's going to lie to you. It's going to be all virtual CPUs, and you don't really know what you're working with. So the issue could be the host. You could have the Cognos environment tuned perfectly, the number of virtual CPUs and RAM on there all look good. It's just slow as dirt. Most likely that means it's old hardware. It's on a old host machine. you need to upgrade that or move it to a more modern enterprise level host machine to kind of get that to run the way you want. And then last but not least, modeling. All that stuff we talked about today, you could have the best hardware, beautiful tuning, everything perfect. If you've got bad data models, that's going to cause issues. Bad join logic, circular joins, Cartesian joins. It doesn't matter how well you kind of tune your Cognos environment, it's going to have issues. So you always want to make sure you have a well-designed model. If you're reporting off transactional system, that's also going to be a huge issue. Those systems are, again, for transactions, not for reporting. That's the whole purpose of data warehousing and just reporting systems. You don't want to be reporting off these transactional systems. So there's ways to kind of handle that, but that's going to be a huge issue. That's going to be something that Cognos can't fix for you. If you're interested in this topic more, Patrick Powers, our own Patrick Powers, is going to be doing a webinar on that on June 23rd. So make sure you sign up for that. Check our calendar for upcoming dates. But yeah, there's just a ton of information here. I try to touch on as much as I can, and we've got a little bit of time left. So I'm going to turn it back over to Steve real quick for a couple slides, and then we'll turn it back up to you guys for Q&A.
All right, thank you, Todd. Just a couple of quick things here. I just wanted to share the things that we at Centurus can help you with in terms of improving your performance. There are a few different paths we can help out. We do offer mentoring where you get Todd or another expert, but often Todd to help mentor one-to-one with your staff to address any performance issues in your environment. We also offer health checks and assessments, which provide a comprehensive overview of the state of your environment and recommendations for how to improve performance. We also have training resources available. We do offer training specifically in Cognos administration. So if that would be useful for your team, please reach out to us for more information. Beyond that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you can visit our website for lots of additional resources. We have log entries, we have previous webinars, slide decks from all those webinars, just a whole bunch of useful information to help you make better use of your Cognos environment. So check out centurus.com/resources for that. We have a few upcoming events I wanted to share. Power BI, Power Automate webinar coming up on May 19th. So if you happen to be operating in a hybrid environment, as I know many of you are nowadays, if you're interested in Power Automate, join us on the 19th. We also have a virtual conference with our partner Incorta later in May, so check that out. And last but not least, in June, we have a webinar presented by our own Patrick Powers on data models and data modeling and how a good data model makes all the difference in a great BI deployment. Just a quick bit of information about Centurus. If you don't already know about us, we concentrate on BI modernizations and migrations across the complete BI stack. We do provide a full spectrum of services, including training and implementation, and we cover Cognos, Power BI, and Tableau to accelerate bimodal BI. So please reach out to us if you have any questions or need help, not only with Cognos, but any hybrid BI environment that you're working in. We have been in business for a good long time, 21 plus years here, 1,350 plus clients, thousands of projects. So we have a lot of experience and a lot of exposure to many of you already who are on this webinar. Happy to have you as customers and always happy to onboard new customers and help you out with your environments. We're also hiring, just a quick note here, if you are interested in the possibility of a role here at Centurus, we're currently looking for a managing consultant and a senior data warehouse and Cognos BI consultant. If you think you may have the right skill set for that and the interest, to reach out to us at our careers page on the Centurus website. You can also send your resume to us at jobs@centurus.com. And with that, I want to jump into the Q&A. We've got a lot of questions in the questions panel, so I'll just apologize in advance. I know Todd won't be able to get through all of these, but we'll try to answer a few of the most common questions we see here. And again, there will be a set of answers provided later after the webinar to the questions we're not able to get to. And if you have a particular question or issue that's a little broader than can fit into the question panel, don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@centauris.com. We'd be happy to set up a free consultation to talk through whatever questions you may have. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Todd. I know we don't have too many minutes left here, so take it away.
Okay. I see a question from Mike Armstrong about monitoring data set size and storage. You can, in the properties, kind of see some basic information as to, I think, how long it took to load, number of rows and things like that. So there's some basic information there. But outside of that, there's not a whole lot of tuning available currently with the Cognos administration as to, to look at that stuff. So I'm hoping that they do add more capabilities around that in the future. Let's see what else we got here. James had a question about the content stored database. It seems that not all of the reports get deleted when a report is deleted using the Cognos web portal interface. That may be kind of what I touched on earlier, that we do have those cleanup strips. There is, the content removal, consistency checks. I'd have to see more exactly about what you mean by not getting deleted, but if you do delete something and run the consistency checks and some of those retention report removal scripts, it should get a lot of the content that could be taking up space in your content stored down. So I'd recommend starting with that. If it's still not doing what you would think it would do, definitely reach out and let us know. We can probably take a look and see if we can figure out what's going on there. Someone asked about Analysis Studio. Again, that is still in the product. It is Firefox only 11.2. Since it's the only browser that supports it now, but it's been marked for deprecation for a long time now. I think 10.2.2 was sort of the last fully supported version of that, so it's been, gosh, almost 7 or 8 years. So those are tools that need to kind of be replaced. And again, there's not exactly a perfect tool in the Cognos 11 suite that does that, but they're pretty comparable, with some cross tabs and some of the settings that you can turn on in the reporting tool, or just using the dashboarding tool. They do interact with cubes and things like that, so it's just a little bit of a learning curve, but there are some options around those studios. Will it be possible that Microsoft Edge will support Query Studio? I don't think so. Again, IBM has been trying to kill off that product for a long time now. I think they know that there's still people dependent upon it, but they don't want to make it any easier or more accessible. So again, something you should probably make plans to address and just bite the bullet on that, because it's not going to be getting any easier as time goes on. It's going to be less and less supported. Event Studio, it's a bit different. I'm hearing talks that they are possibly going, it's not deprecated, that it's still supported. However, the interface hasn't been updated since Cognos 10. I keep hearing rumors that they are going to redesign the whole UI, because that is, in my opinion, a really nice tool that a lot of people depend on. It just needs a front-end refresh. So nothing concrete, but I know they do want to eventually, that new Cognos 11 interface called the Glass UI, they want to add that as a sort of more built-in piece of that, the Cognos 11 front end, the Glass UI. So I will definitely either blog or post something about that if I can get more information. Our reports are significantly faster than dashboards accessing the same data. We were at 11.2, 11.1.2. The dashboards have performance. Yeah, so actually 11.2 had a major dashboard performance enhancement. I'm not exactly sure what they did, but they threw out some number like 700% faster dashboard loading. So I think if you've migrated to 11.2, you have to run your dashboard one time. It will load it in a certain way, and then you can save it and then that dashboard should instantly load very quickly. Whereas in the past, you kind of watch things spin and each widget would kind of take its time, to display the data. It comes up very, very quick now. So if you're looking to see, dashboard performance, 11.2 upgrade is going to really pay large dividends just by installing the software. Looks like someone already got the routing rules documentation. That's definitely out there. If you Google it, also reach out if you have more questions about it. But that's something I'm a big fan of, the routing rules. I really like to kind of create custom solutions with that. Let's see. Access to the IPA. Back to that slide. It is under the run options. Where is it? So if you were in the report editor and you click the little play button that says, HTML or an HTML or in a PDF, the last option should say run options. Click on it and you'll get this window right here. And it's this sort of little slider here, include performance details. Just turn it on, click OK, run that report in HTML, and you'll get, each one of these little execution time boxes underneath all the objects, and then a subtotal, page total at the bottom here. So pretty easy to turn on, and I think it automatically, goes away once you exit the report, so you don't have to worry about it staying in the report or users seeing these numbers. Nothing you have to do. It's just a session-only specific setting. How are we doing on time?
We're just a few minutes over here, Todd. There's one question here. Peter asked about saving report outputs into a separate database rather than in the content store. Can you speak to that? I know you can save to file system outputs. I don't know whether.
Yeah, so there's obviously the file system. Yeah, the file system you can save to, which is a great way to do it. That way, one, it's accessible to people outside of Cognos. You don't even have to log in and use up any kind of resources at all for users. You put it on a shared, export it to a shared folder that people can access, and they can just pick them up there. But in addition to that, you can set up a notification database, which I kind of touched on towards the end of the deck there. And that notification database is then going to be separate from your content store database, and it's going to have all those outputs. It's going to have all the schedules, all that activity stored there, which will make it much cleaner and more efficient in your content store database, so you don't have to deal with that. So, customers who have schedules just running all day long, tons of activity, it really makes a huge difference to kind of take all that noise out of the content store database and put it in the notification database. So it sounds like that might be the better solution for what you're asking there.
Great, thanks, Todd. So I think we should wrap up here because we are a little over time. If we didn't get to your question here today, again, we'll answer the questions and provide a list of all of those out to all of the attendees after the fact. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you, Todd, for sharing all of your wisdom today from all these years in the Cognos world. And thank you to all of you for attending. We look forward to having you at a future webinar. And if you'd like to reach out to us with any questions, and if you need any help on your Cognos performance tuning needs, you can contact us at Centurus.com or by email or by telephone. So we'd love to hear from you. Always happy to help. Always happy to share our experience. So with that, let's wrap it up and have a great rest of the day, everyone.